Good morning. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this exciting event. I'm Sarah Anzia. I'm a professor here at UC Berkeley in the Goldman School of Public Policy and the Travers Department of Political Science. This year, I'm also a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. And for the last 2 years, I've had the pleasure of being faculty director of BLI, the Baxter Liberty Initiative. BLI has been an important part of what we do here at UC Berkeley for more than a decade. Through this initiative, we've been able to bring a truly impressive group of thought leaders to our campus for the benefit of our students and our community. BLI has been dedicated to fostering a campus culture that values diversity of thought and respectful dialogue. BLI is housed in the Charles and Louise Travers Department of Political Science in the College of Letters and Science, and it has been a leader and primary campus partner in exposing our students, faculty, and alumni to a broad spectrum of ideas. We're so grateful to Ambassador Frank Baxter for his leadership and his efforts in what is now a growing enterprise. Thanks to Ambassador Baxter and a dedicated group of alumni committed to the ideals of this university and the BLI, we are able to expand our programming to include events like this today. Thank you, Ambassador Baxter, and thank you to the BLI Task Force. Before we begin, I want to remind us of some general rules so that everyone can fully enjoy the program. Please silence your cell phones, stay in your seats, and keep the aisles clear for safety reasons. Please do not engage in any action that disrupts the event or prevents the speakers from being heard. Individuals who do so may be asked to leave or referred to the appropriate conduct offices. Thank you for joining us for this very important conversation. It's now my privilege to introduce Ambassador Frank Baxter. Ambassador Baxter was born in and attended school in Northern California. He served in the Air Force for 4 years before entering college. He graduated from the University of California, Berkeley with a degree in economics with honors. After college, he worked for a number of firms in banking and global securities. He's a former director of the National Association of Securities Directors, the group that oversees the NASDAQ stock exchange. He served on the board of NASDAQ and is former director of the Securities Industry Association. He was sworn in as U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Uruguay in 2006. Before I turn it over to Ambassador Baxter to introduce our distinguished speakers, I want to thank you personally, Frank, for everything you've done for UC Berkeley. Thanks to your work with us over the last several decades and your vision and your partnership, today we're able to address such an important, timely topic. Thank you, Frank, and welcome.
I have the honor of introducing the panelists, and our esteemed moderator is Andy Barquette. He's the founder of new generative AI startup Muriel, an enterprise information retrieval system. He's an investor and advisor to several tech startups and previously worked at Google, Facebook, and NVIDIA. From 2013 to 2015, Andy served as the inaugural Chief Technology Officer for the Republican National Committee. At UC Berkeley, and he serves on the Baxter Liberty Initiative Task Force and is co-president of the Political Economy Alumni Association. Andy graduated from UC Berkeley with a degree in political economy. Andy?
Thank you, Ambassador.
Someone that everyone knows is our first panelist. Carol Christ is the Chancellor of UC Berkeley. Chancellor Christ spent more than 3 decades as a professor administrator at UC Berkeley before serving as president of Smith College. Since her return to Berkeley, she has worked to foster community and improve the campus climate for people of all backgrounds, celebrate the institution's long-standing commitment to free speech, strengthen Berkeley's financial position, address a housing shortage, and develop a 10-year strategic plan for the campus. A celebrated scholar of Victorian literature, Chancellor is also well known as an advocate for quality, accessible public higher education, a proponent of the value of a broad education in the liberal arts and sciences, and a champion of women's issues and diversity on college campuses. I guess everybody knows that today running a university is a pretty risky position. And our Chancellor has done it admirably. As we've seen from other instances, it requires a lot of courage. And we have someone who has a lot of courage and a lot of grace. We're really lucky to have her. Our second panelist is Secretary Condoleezza Rice. She is the Tad and Diane Dobb Director of the Hoover Institution, which I'm happy to say I'm a member of, and a Senior Fellow on Public Policy. She is the Denning Professor in Global Business and the Economy of the Stanford Graduate School of Business. In addition, she is a founding partner of Rice, Hadley, Gates, and Manuel LLC, an international strategic consulting firm. She currently serves on the board of C3 AI and AI software company, and Makina Capital Management, a private endowment fund. She is also part owner of the Denver Broncos. From January 2005 to January 2009, Rice served as the 66th Secretary of State of the United States, the second woman and the first Black woman to hold the post. She also served as President George W. Bush's assistant to the President for National Security Affairs from January 2001 to January 2005, the first woman to hold that position. She has served as Stanford University's provost. She has also been on the Stanford faculty as a professor of political science since 1981 and has won two of the university's highest teaching honors. She has authored and co-authored numerous books, most recently To Build a Better World, Choices to End the Cold War and Create a Global Commonwealth, co-authored with Philip Zelikow. I had the honor and privilege of serving as U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Uruguay when Condi was our Secretary of State. And just to give some indication to show her spunk, among other things. President Bush and Mrs. Bush and Secretary Rice called on in Uruguay, and one of the customs in the State Department is that when a VIP comes, they meet with the staff. In this case, the staff went to the hotel where the president was staying, and my responsibility with my wife, Kathy, was to stay at the door of the hotel where the president and first lady were going to be coming out. And before that, the president of Uruguay, who had had a bad experience with another president a week or so before, he had told him, he'd asked the other president to come casual, and the other guy showed up all decked out and embarrassed, the president of Uruguay. So the president of Uruguay said, would you please ask President Bush to show up casual? I said, of course I would. So as the door was open, there was the president all decked out in the nicest. There was no Texas about him. So I said, Mr. President, would you please be more casual? And he grumbled a bit. And then Secretary Rice stepped in and was more forthright in asking him to be more casual. And he grunted a little bit, and I nicely said, there's been a lot of second guessing this morning. And I said, Mr. President, my lips are sealed. And then he smiled, yes, but Condi's aren't. And they weren't, and they aren't, and she's a great spokesman. My time at Uruguay was really the background for what was the Baxter Liberty Lecture, and now the Berkeley Liberty Lecture. Uruguay is known by the economists as one of the two most democratic countries in Latin America. And another thing, they copied the United States having a separation of power, a separate executive, the rule of law. So there's some combination there. So as I was impressed by their progress and by our progress, I learned that our founder had looked at governments before them or empires before them, and they saw that all of them failed. So they designed a government that comes up in the Constitution with separation of power, limited powers, the rule of law, individual responsibility, individual freedom. And the result is, with all of our faults as well as our good points, we're almost going to be around for a quarter of a millennia. And I thought that we all kind of know that, but we should get thinkers who would tell more about not to proselytize, but to inform. So we had speakers, many from the Hoover Institution, who would go through every aspect of the democracy that we have. We had speakers from the right and from the left and in the center. And during this period, we have realized that there is another challenge to our democracy, as there always will be, which is what George Washington talked about: factions, about having strict partisanship, that courtesy and just tolerance for others have declined. So we are moving our emphasis to viewpoint diversity, and I don't think we have any better speakers than Secretary Rice and the Chancellor to herald that change in our mission. So I will leave it to them.
Okay, well, thank you everybody again for coming. Audience, Secretary Rice, Chancellor Christ, very excited about this topic. I want to jump right into it and start with the simplest and perhaps most important question, which is, how do you define free speech?
Well, first of all, let's just remember that democracy is worth it, even if it's sometimes noisy. Because free speech has to have within it the view that you are willing to listen to others as well. Now, no democracy can exist without freedom of speech. In fact, there's a very interesting historical analogy or analysis that says that actually the free speech movement gained its greatest adherents in the United States around the question of abolition. Because the abolitionists believed that if they had free speech to tell the truth about what was going on in slavery, they could win the day. And so their reasoned arguments about why slavery was a crime had to be heard. And therefore, freedom of speech, which had been enshrined in the Constitution by the Founding Fathers, really gained life around this idea that only with free speech can you seek the truth. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind in universities, that's what we have to keep in mind in our daily lives, is that without free speech, we can't seek the truth.
Fantastic. Chancellor Christ?
Yeah, that's so interesting, the way in which you have defined the context of free speech. I always think free speech is speech that is not subject to censorship, with the exception that it cannot immediately call for physical harm against another person. But that definition of free speech is very much a product of the 19th century. And John Stuart Mill, who felt that it's only in the marketplace of ideas where all speech is free that the truth will prevail. And one of the questions that I've kept asking myself about free speech today is, does our internet world change John Stuart Mill's vision? Is there any longer a single marketplace of ideas in which the right and the wrong can butt heads and the right will prevail?
I think it's getting harder. And I think it's getting harder because what the internet has done is to turn the marketplace, if you will, into small marketplaces where we each seek the opinions and the views of those who agree with us. So if you think about it, now I'm going to date myself. My family watched the Huntley-Brinkley Report every night. Now, some families watched Walter Cronkite, others watched Howard K. Smith. Yes, if you were maybe a generation later, you watched Brokaw and Peter Jennings and Dan Rather. But we pretty much had a place where ideas and information were shared, and we had some common basis for looking at major events. If you think about now, I can go to my cable news, I can go to my aggregators, I can go to my bloggers. I never actually encounter anybody who thinks differently. And now when I encounter someone who thinks differently, I think they're either stupid or venal. And I think that's why the marketplace of ideas, if you will, is breaking down. And I just want to say that what you're doing here, Carol, and what Ambassador Baxter has started here is extremely important, because of all the places that we have to have a marketplace of ideas, it's the university. And without that in the university cannot truly say that it is a place that is seeking the best answers, seeking the truth, so to speak, if we can't have free speech on university campuses.
Can I ask a follow-up question about that? What are the unique challenges within the university context? And perhaps, since we have someone here from the world's leading public and private institutions, perhaps maybe contrast a little bit how those challenges are different in a public versus a private university.
Well, one of the unique challenges of the university is the fact that a quarter of our population changes. And the years that students are at the university is one of these wonderful years, many of them between 18 and 22, when they are trying to discover their identity, the kinds of tenets that are going to define their beliefs. And so that's a very interesting time. It's a really volatile time. So it means that you can't say something once, that the project of free speech has to be a continuous project for the university because of this really changing population, which is what gives the university its vitality.
I agree completely. I also think we have special challenges in the last several years. I've taught now for 40 years. Yes, they hired me when I was 11. But the student today is encouraged to come with very strongly held views. And that's just fine. But I say to my students all the time, first of all, just because you think it, it may not be so. And so subjecting those ideas to the test of can they stand against ideas that are different is very, and when we were young, we all had that sense of very strongly held ideas. But again, in an environment in which you're not encouraged, because of the internet, when you're not encouraged to seek out those who would think differently, it tends to cement those ideas much more strongly, and it's harder to break through. I also know that, and I love my students, I do, but they think that if they've Googled it, they've researched it. And so this need to go into depth, the need to realize that issues are complex, history is complex. I said to my students, I'm teaching a class this quarter, and I said, my ancestors were slaves and they were slave owners. And there was a gasp around the room. And I realized that that uncomfortable fact about slavery was rarely talked about in the way that we teach history. So I think we have new challenges as this generation has grown up with a particular way of getting their information. But the basic challenge of the constant turnover is really quite difficult.
There's also I'm sure you all know the childhood taunt, sticks and stones can break my bones, but names can never hurt me. There's a very different sense in today's culture that names can hurt, and that has a chilling effect on speech. We also so lack models in the world outside the university of people with different views having civil disagreements with each other and trying to reach some common truth.
That's right. This concept of harm associated with language and with words has become a problem because if you are harming me, now there has to be... Just for the record, I spent a lot of my time as Secretary of State trying to get a Palestinian state. And so...
Well, and my family is Lebanese.
Yes.
And is on both sides of that
right,
conflict.
That's right.
So.
But my point, just in brief, is that I think when we speak in that language, it does have a freezing effect. Because as you said earlier, when we have the constitutionally protected right to free speech, it means that I can't harm you. But when the words are now associated with harm, now it gets very, very difficult to manage a classroom, to manage a conversation, and I think we have to somehow get away from that.
Does the university have a role in defining what precisely constitutes harmful or hate speech, or is that something that should be done by, the courts and society at large and simply followed in the universities?
I've come to think deeply about free speech particularly over the last 6 months or so. I've come to think that free speech, though an absolute and a value, isn't sufficient in terms of thinking about community, that you also need to have principles of community. I say often, just because you have the right to say something doesn't mean that it's right to say. And so having that dialogue of what it is, having that dialogue about what it is that both speaks your truth, but also upholds the values of the community of which you're a part.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that this is a particularly delicate balance to strike. On the one hand, you do have, as you said, the right to say whatever you wish. I sometimes hope that when something is said that is offensive, that the first impulse isn't to go and protest that it was offensive. I've often said, listen, none of us has a constitutional right not to be offended. But we can turn to the person next to us and say, that was offensive. And here's why that was offensive. And could we talk about the fact that that was offensive? And I think that's how you build a stronger community in which I understand the circumstances from which you are coming and why that particular language might be hurtful to you. And in a community, we want everybody to be respected. We want everybody to be in a community where they can be successful. And none of us, as a member of a community, should want to be in a position in which people feel badly or assaulted. And so, I think it has to be not really the authorities that do that, but somehow a community that embraces those values. And we do have some advantages in that we have classrooms in which we can embrace those values. We have residence halls in which we can embrace those values. I often think that sports teams embrace those values extremely well because they have something in common. And if somebody is hurting in that sports team, other members of that team are going to want to take care of it. And so I think to the degree that you can bring it to the community level, you're safer on the free speech side.
Yeah, I agree with that. There was a set of cases, I think it was in the early 2000s, a number of public universities tried to create definitions of hate speech and prohibit them. Every single one that was challenged in the courts lost. So there is not a good track record, at least for publics, in being able to create principles that define hate speech.
And I think you asked earlier, is there a difference between private and public? Theoretically, yes, but really only theoretically, because and in some states now you do have legislators and others getting involved in these questions of what kind of speech on campus, what kind of programs on campuses. Even though I understand the intent, I think that's extremely harmful. And my hope is that the universities are allowed to deal with these very delicate issues on their own. What usually happens in a private university is that somebody will say, well, yes, you're private, but you take government funding, don't you? And therefore, I think the distinction may be a little less bright red line than we sometimes think.
That's a great point. And, even if it's just within a community, even if it's not an official university policy, And I think both of you do this very well already. But how do people in a university context model the right behavior? How do they teach people how to participate in that community, respect other people's rights, and practice free speech in a responsible way in an intellectual community?
The thing that I try to do, and I think faculty in particular have an obligation to do, is to remember that we are not here to teach our students what to think. We're here to teach them how to think. We're here to teach them how to analyze, how to mobilize evidence and data, how to sustain an argument, how to take into consideration arguments that may take the other side. And so in the classroom in particular, I try to do that. And I hope, I'm a very public figure, so it's not as if my students don't know my views, but I try very hard, even harder perhaps then, to make clear to them that those views don't govern the classroom. So when I teach about Afghanistan or when I teach about Iraq, I try very hard to find the harshest critics of what the Bush administration did and to assign those as readings. Because I want my students to know that what I think really shouldn't matter here. How they think, can they defend an argument? That's what matters in my classroom.
What we need to do is build in, I was going to say our students, but really I think it's build in our whole community a greater capacity for dialogue. And you can do that in many different ways. Universities are fortunate that we have lots of different kinds of events. We have public forums like this one, in which you can model dialogue between people who do not agree. We have the classroom that Condoleezza was talking about, and then we have to create the space for private conversations. So speech is, I often think that Berkeley has an abundance of public space, but does less well at the private space. And there are other institutions in which it's exactly reversed. But taking opportunity of all the different settings in which people speak to both model and teach civil disagreement, I think is an important mission of the university.
I was just going to add that I think we have to reaffirm the norms of the university. One of my best friends at Stanford, we came into political science together, and her politics are very, very left. But we share certain norms about the university, that the classroom is not a place for your political views, that everybody gets a chance to speak. And we've seen an erosion of those norms that has caused the two of us to have many, many, many now conversations about how that could have happened. And I'm of a generation where I think those norms were shared across the political spectrum. And now at both ends of the political spectrum, you're starting to see that people don't understand those norms in the university. And we're going to have to fight for those norms now, because if a couple of more generations pass, I think it could be lost forever in the university.
That's a really important point. I mean, what do you think we can do, whether it's within a university or outside of university, to restore or revitalize those norms, especially given that student population turns over 25% every year? So it's hard to kind of maintain those normative behaviors.
One of the things that we are developing at Berkeley is a course in free speech for all freshmen that will be part of their first semester's work. So that's one thing we can do. I think we have to use all the power of our norms in whatever ways we instate them in the community to stress both free speech, but even more important than free speech, the power of civil dialogue.
Yes, we also at Stanford have instituted a first-year sequence in which civic responsibility, citizenship, civic culture, civil discourse are emphasized. And I think we can do it in our orientation. We probably won't go as far as Chicago, where they basically said, if you don't like it, don't come here. I don't think we'll go that far. But we do need to inculcate those values early. And then someone said, and then we need a booster shot around junior year.
Do the professors have a responsibility, in your opinions, to kind of do what you were saying, Secretary Rice, which is to make sure that they cover the range of applicable things? Is it, I mean, I can see an argument that says within a university a professor should be able to teach a course that has a particular ideological bent, or teach a survey course that explains everything. To what extent is there a responsibility when you're teaching to try to cover the diversity of different ideas about an important topic?
Well, going back to something Secretary Rice said a little while ago, you're trying to teach students how to think. And admittedly, Victorian literature is not the most controversial subject in the world, but
I don't know.
Whenever I teach something on which I have a strong point of view, in which I know others differ from me, I always say, this is another point of view you could have about this. This is how I reached my point of view. But I think it's so critical, particularly when you're teaching in an area in which people have sharply differing opinions, to not only justify your opinions, but to take the students through how you would get to a different set of opinions.
Exactly. I completely agree. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question about broader than the university context, getting back to the issues of society at large, the media polarization, the way that online communication has changed this? What do the changes in norms for the rest of the 21st century need to look like? And is there a difference between 20th century free speech and 21st century free speech in our society?
Well, we're going to have to fight harder in the 21st century because of all of the dynamics that we've been talking about, the technology, and the fact that it's now pretty deeply rooted. The way that you get your news is deeply rooted. I was laughing the other day. Somebody said, one day we're going to tell our grandchildren, here's how you got your news. Somebody stayed up all night printing it on this paper, and then we threw it at your house in the morning. And since almost nobody gets their news that way anymore, we are going to have to live with where we are. We also have to live with the distortions that are now taking place, whether it is distortion in social media, potential distortion through something like AI algorithms that can make President Biden say something he really didn't say. I think it's getting harder in the 21st century, and so we need to go back to the foundations of why we have it, this free speech, what it means. People don't really understand, I think, unless they have studied it or been to other places, what it means to live in a society where you cannot say what you think. Now, I study those societies. I studied Russia very deeply. And to be in a society where not only can you not say what you think, but if you say what you think, you're going to be thrown in prison for it, or in the case of Navalny, you're going to be poisoned and then killed. When we start as Americans or as people in democracies, we need to really value what it means to be able to say what you think. Protect it, but protect it for others as well.
Yeah, what we've lost that we had to a certain extent in the 20th century, we talked about Huntley and Berkeley and Walter Cronkite before. I remember Walter Cronkite's sign-off every night. That's the way it is. Yes. And we don't have any longer a sense that that's the way it is, that there isn't, in so many areas, a shared truth. I keep thinking one of the ways forward is to resist the kind of labeling that seems to go on almost as a knee-jerk reaction. I know that there was a group in Congress that was meeting together, No More Labels.
No More Labels.
And I think it's so important that we understand that people and their views are more complex than any label you might approve, rather than immediately jumping to the label.
And that is going to be the responsibility of all of us, because I do think that jumping to the labels really empowers the extremes.
Yes.
Because now I'm just a label. And when you think about what's going on, and what you wish to do if you are in a position like ours of authority, or a parent for that matter, is to say you really have an obligation to listen to others. And that's going to have to come here, because I think what we're seeing in Washington is actually more a reflection of us than we would like to believe. Because the people in our politics are responding to something. I know a lot of politicians, all right? And their incentives are to respond to what will get them elected. Their incentives are to respond to what will get them on television. Their incentives are to respond to, as I was saying, the problem is that our politicians are responding to something that they think will get them elected. And that means the extremes are getting the most clicks. Yeah. The more disagreeable you are, the more line of sight you have. If you can be really disagreeable, you'll get on the evening news. And so when we think about it that way, what are they responding to? It becomes our responsibility, not just theirs, to make sure that differing views are heard.
Yes, I agree.
Thank you. I think your point about the internet and the AI and the deep fake issue is a really important one. And so when we think about this tendency to find your little audience that either makes you feel good on the internet or makes you money or gets you elected to Congress because you found a little angry audience, how do you see
Yes, next.
So when we think about the deep fakes and the benefit that people get right now by finding that little audience, how do we change that? How do we make it popular again for a congressperson to say, you know what, here's a good compromise? Or for a university president or chancellor to say, here's a tough issue and here's how our university's doing a good job of bringing those sides together on this tough issue. Yeah. How do we get to somewhere where public figures can start to have an incentive to go back to a compromise or a middle road?
That's a really, really interesting question. I think in part the answer lies in the news media and how they cover it. I'm so struck by all the news coverage we get when there's a disruptive event and speech goes well, no protesters, not a news story. And I think that it has to be, I mean, I wish I had a sweeping answer to your question that would say like that, it would get better. But in fact, I think it has to be a culture change, but that communications is extraordinarily important in that culture change.
We are running out of time, so I want to wrap up by offering each of the panelists that's not a line, like I have a little clock here, it actually tells me we're running out of time. But I want to ask each of the panelists if they have any closing remarks they'd like to make.
Well, I just wanted to say one word about our officials. You know, Madison said that constant contestation is necessary in democracy. And somehow we've got to find a way to let people know that it's okay to contest and to compromise, but that not every political battle has to be a moral victory over your opponent. And it's going to take some time. I think we're going the other way right now, but I think in time that message will get there. So my closing remark would be, first of all, to thank those in our audience, but especially to thank Chancellor Christ. There is no harder I was a public figure in Washington, and you know, criticism comes with the game, and you understand that when you go in and you do your best and then you leave. But to be a university president these days, I think, is not just one of the toughest jobs, it's one of the most important jobs. Because all that we've been talking about free speech, about the university as a place where truth needs to be sought and therefore differing views have to be heard, it's never been harder. I was provost of Stanford from '93 until '99, so I know what university administration is all about, but we didn't have as active an internet. There was no social media. And we had lots and lots of protests, there's no doubt about that. But the sense of anger that is there on college campuses today, particularly after the events of October, is something that I've not experienced as a university person. And I think it takes an enormously courageous person with a very cool head to manage a place like this. And so thank you, Carol, for everything you've done.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for those really generous words. People often ask whether being the chancellor or being a president is like being a CEO, and I say, no way. That is much more like being the mayor of a very complicated city. And in our cities today, the fringes have lost the confidence that we can have conversation, and so choose the tactic that you saw a lot today, repeatedly, of shutting down speech rather than engaging in speech. And I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank you for your belief in free speech. And I know we're all going to, again, commit ourselves to teaching what I think is the most fundamental lesson of a democracy, that you have to you always have to vote for free speech, even when it's deeply uncomfortable for you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and if we could have a round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you.
And thank you to the Berkeley Liberty Initiative, Baxter Liberty Initiative, for putting this event together. Thank you to the audience for attending, and those of you by Zoom as well. We really appreciate everyone participating, except for a couple who were less helpful. We appreciate all the civic and responsible participation. And thank you again, everyone, for coming. We hope to have more events like this in the future.
Thank you.